Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan sharing time with Deputy Finney McGrath, Catherine Murphy, Luke May Flanagan, Seamus Healy and Matthew McGrath. 5 minutes each.
Gurmagad Cian Corla. Thoisgam Grevan over Shaw Flagan and Shakton Shakacha, but she didn't go she talk to Will she off Flagan and Noct. Agus but while the man is a hurt week, Chakta Dala Collins, the rare and Uber Ian She Goram Billy Show. I was reading back through material that I'd gathered in relation to mortgages, and I just was struck by what the various researchers and groups who are involved in this had put together as important principles when it comes to mortgages. And these are people who have a strong track record on anti-poverty issues, including debt and credit and housing. And the first principle was to accept that it's inability to pay rather than being unwilling to do so, which means that there's a need for multidimensional response. And okay, I accept that human nature being what it is, and we're all flawed human beings, that there will be some who will choose not to pay, not because they can't, but because that they just won't. Which brings me to the second principle, the need for data, and that all policy initiatives have to be undertaken consistent with reliable and accurate data, and some of that has been missing. The solutions have to take all debt liabilities into account, otherwise the solution won't be workable. Debt write-off, I know it doesn't sit easy with some, but if people have been paying honestly and trying to do their best to pay that, then it can come to the point where the practical thing to do and the most common sense approach is to write that debt off. There is another principle that debtors need adequate representation in negotiations and that the cost is not prohibitive. There is a need also, another principle of a minimum income, that people have to be able to meet their basic needs while they are repaying their debt, and that another aim would be that people will be kept in their homes, whether it is an ongoing mortgage holder or as a tenant. But there was a point, principles, that I just wanted to look at, and I mentioned it last week when we were speaking on this motion also, and it was in the Fianna Fáil motion about keeping people in their homes, and where repossession occurs, that there would be appropriate social housing and social welfare rights to be provided. The Fianna Fáil motion said that the mortgage arrears crisis represents the greatest social challenge facing the state. I disagreed with that, because I think we have to look at housing generally, and I certainly know where I represent there is a dire shortage of housing, whether it's social housing, whether it is private rented accommodation, or whether it's local authority. So when we come to looking at it as a crisis, I think we have to include all of that with the mortgage distress, and I think everything has to be done so that we ensure that people can stay in their homes and they're not adding, certainly in certain constituencies, to an already really enormous list that people are not, the local authority, the private rented, social, they're not getting through that. The other principle was in relation to personal insolvency, that it is adequate and adequately transparent. I think this bill from Deputy Collins is trying to address those areas not adequately covered in the personal insolvency arrangement. There's a specific proposal for mortgage debt arrangement which will be added on to the provisions in the Personal Insolvency Act, and I think it's trying to regulate the relationship between the debtor, the bank and PIP. I think it addresses the reasonable standard of living, and it acknowledges that families need discretionary spending, and we do know that it's families and households who spend money, they spend the most, and if we can get them spending again, that's going to be a boost to the economy. If the measures brought into date were working, then we would see the result in the statistics. But what we're seeing is the opposite. Over 97,000 mortgage holders with a total value of 18.6 billion in arrears by more than 90 days. And I think this bill is trying to ensure that the owner-occupier of a residential property is protected. I know there are genuine fears by people that the Personal Insolvency Act was really designed for business people and people with multiple properties. And the rationale behind this Act is that it would force the banks to deal with the homeowner debt. I think it's terrible what has been said in this House that it is assuming that all those in mortgage distress are these strategic defaulters. I think that's a serious mistake, and it seems to be determining the kind of policies that are coming in. We know that the government has bailed out the banks at enormous expense, and I think the banks have to play their part through genuine, realistic engagement with those in distress. I think this Act just might force banks to do that and to deal with the homeowner. And as we're very struck by parliamentary democracy with the referendum coming on Friday, I think it would be part of parliamentary democracy if we accepted that there is wisdom and insight on all sides of the House, and that it's not confined to the government benches, and that the government might just acknowledge that there is wisdom and insight in this particular bill.
Thank you, Deputy.